it takes courage to ask for help. Like
Yeah.
it takes toughness to ask for help. And so I think there's potentially the way to help them see it as that of like, oh yeah, like it that is tough. Like I got to be strong to ask for help.
Welcome back to the In Good Company podcast. Today, we're talking about masculinities and how these qualities, behaviors, and roles associated with being a man can influence our health. Now, our self-identity can be something that we hold quite close. It's pretty easy to get your back up when we're having these conversations, but it's not necessarily about telling guys they need to change. What I'm interested in is understanding where these ideas come from and how we can navigate them to connect better and more authentically with our buddies. To unpack this, I'm going to chat with Dr. Matt Genuchi. Matt is a licensed psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychological Science at Boise State University in the United States. His work focuses on understanding how masculinities impact men's experience of mental health. So, welcome to the show, Matt. Thank you for being here.
Hey, good to be with you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to see you again. I reckon it's summer for you, isn't it? So you're on a little bit of holidays off and on.
It is summer. It is 100 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm naive. I don't know what that translates to in Celsius here in the US, but it's hot here in Idaho. Yeah, in summertime, so things are just nice and slow, but yeah, not too much left. Things will gear back up again.
Yeah, I still haven't quite got my head wrapped around it being in air quotes winter in Australia.
Yeah, yeah.
Coming into, July and August, it doesn't really feel like it should be.
What does
But
it feel like now in Sydney? Because you're in Sydney, right? Like,
yes, yeah.
correct?
I think it's about 13, 14 degrees.
Okay.
But
That
my
cool. Is that cool? Cold?
my peeve here, it feels cold. And my
Okay.
pet peeve is that I don't believe that they insulate their buildings like they do in Canada and probably the US. So it's basically as cold outside as it is inside. You turn the heat on for 5 minutes and it'll just dissipate and you'll be cold again. So they could take some lessons from Canada in that regard, I think.
I would imagine that the Canadians know how to insulate. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're good at it. So thank you for being on the show. Now, I know you have expertise around men's mental health and masculinities, and I want to talk today specifically about this idea of men's identity, what it means to be a man. It's a particularly hot topic, especially in pop culture right now. There's a lot of debate around,
Sure.
what is a man? What does it mean to be a man? And so we, in our recent study, talked a lot about social connection and peer support with guys. And
Okay.
part of that study was we had men submit photos and talk about their experiences connecting, interacting, and creating some deeper, more authentic connections with their buddies. And so some of the photos were around this idea where guys felt pressure to be strong and stoic and independent in dealing with their own challenges. They could help others, but they couldn't necessarily ask for help themselves.
Yeah.
And one of the metaphors that I found particularly powerful was this idea of a mask. And one of the photos was actually, it looks like it was maybe made by their kid, a paper mache Spider-Man mask, and it was all painted up. And the gentleman pointed out that this was the mask that he often had to wear being a superhero. And he said that the mouth was covered, that these superhero masks don't generally have a mouthpiece. So the culture was around being a hero, being selfless, and not talking about your own issues, which I just found so fascinating as a metaphor.
Yeah, I imagine that lots of guys could say, yeah, yeah, I feel that way. I feel constrained in some way, shape, or form by their masculinity, right? That they feel like they can do some things and they can't do other things. In some ways, they have to act certain ways, right? In certain times. And so yeah, they have to put that mask on. And did I hear you say too that part of it was with the mask, the mouth was covered? Is that what I heard too?
Yeah, that's what he pointed out.
Yeah. That piece is really interesting too to hear about, like not just the masking piece, but also the like, I don't know, that's something about like the the communicating, the talking, the asking, whatever that is, that seems poignant about that metaphor.
Absolutely. And there was another one around, the guy talked about putting on a costume that
Mm.
he presented himself to the world, that it wasn't truly his identity. And it makes sense to me that this would not only impact how you interact with other people, but how you connect with other guys. If you aren't being your true authentic self, clearly that's going to be a challenge to opening up and connecting with people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you feel like that you can't be your real self and they don't understand who you really are. Yeah, and just the energy that that takes, right? To not duplicitous in the sense of like trying to deceive people, right, in a mean kind of way, but just the energy that it takes to kind of live two lives, right? You think of Clark Kent and all the work that he has to do to be Clark Kent and be Superman, right? To be the two different guys. And it is so, I would just imagine that that's a pretty exhausting life. I haven't met Clark Kent, and I'm not super into the superhero stuff, but I could just think of translating that to just your average guy who feels like maybe there's one or two people, maybe like my partner, maybe like a close friend or somebody like that that knows me, right? Like the kind of all those integrated selves, but everybody else I've got to like, kind of go back and forth and I've got to put on those glasses and I've got to hide. Like it's just the exhaustion that comes with that. And I think that
Mhm.
leads us to think of how hard that is and have empathy for those guys, right?
Yeah, and I would suggest, from the conversations that I've had with guys, and maybe you can attest to this, even personally, that I think this is quite a common idea, right? To varying degrees. I think the general consensus is the vast majority of men understand what these pressures are, and they feel a certain amount of pressure to act and be a certain way, to present themselves in a certain way. And, we might call this an idea around masculinity, right? What it means to be a man. So, where do these traditional views come from around masculinity?
I mean, what I was just thinking of, I mean, this doesn't quite get it. Where does it come from objectively, like in the big picture of all things? But you're thinking, why do guys do this, right? Like, why would they do this thing that is difficult for them, exhausting for them? Maybe many of them would say, I would prefer, right, not to put those masks on or not to have to transition right between the superhero and then the real me. I think for a lot of guys, it's how they've learned how to survive in the world, right? From being a boy, right, where you've learned that, oh yeah, I put myself out there. I put that real me out there. I showed my feelings, or I
Mhm.
was vulnerable in some way, shape, or form, and they got shut down. They were punished. They were bullied by their peers, their parents. I mean, who knows, right? And so the way they learned how to survive in the world is I'm just going to lock that in. I'm going to hide it and keep it from other people. And so it helped them survive. So it was adaptive for them then, right? The challenge is that often as guys get older, at least like what I've seen a bit more, and I'm kind of thinking of just the some of the guys that I saw when I used to see guys like in clinical practice, like it was adaptive for them to hide themselves, hide their feelings, numb their feelings, when they were younger. But right now they're married, they have partners, they have kids, and these people they want more. They actually want to see the full self. They want to see that authentic self. These guys don't really have the skills to do that, right? And so it's not adaptive for them anymore. So that's one piece that I'm thinking of, kind of where does it come from? Well, it comes from, an adaptive place
Mhm.
initially, but often for guys, it doesn't work for them anymore.
Mhm. And I guess it comes back to that age old question of nature or nurture. Is it a biological thing that a guy is a guy, or is it that we are influenced by the world we live in? And those are two very overlapping pieces, right? They're hard to disentangle, right? So I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Oh man, curious on what my take is on that. Goodness. I mean, To some degree, I think it has to be both, right? Where it is something that's cultural. And I think that as a psychologist, my error often is to think like, well, this is cultural, right? So we learn all this. It's all socially constructed. Men learn about like self-reliance and emotional control, et cetera. It's stoicism. And so therefore we can socially reconstruct it, right?
Hmm.
And so I think I always have to be, mindful of that, of like, yes, I believe that is true. Alternatively, there are biological factors that influence men, around their tendency towards, aggression, rough and tumble play
Hmm.
as boys, etc. Things like that that are also factors that influence them as boys and men, right? And those are real. And so yeah, it's both. And as far as like over time, how did that, influence the development of traditional masculinities early on? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to. But I think it's both, and I think it's important for us to be mindful of both of those.
Yeah. And kind of my take is that there certainly is a biological aspect to it. And I think that is evidenced. But I think these points can be exaggerated through social influences, right? And I think there's a key distinction here that is often misunderstood around, well, if masculinity is such a problem, just stop doing it, right? Like it's this kind of switch that you turn on and off. And, yeah, you're being pressured, but, just step up and do it differently. But I think
Mm,
there's different from putting on the mask and taking off the mask, that is kind of wrapped up in who you are. So that again can also be difficult to disentangle with your own, who am I really? Because I've been raised to be this way my whole life. I am a product of the world that I live in.
yeah, totally. And that gets back to that identity piece. So yeah, if I have to be tough and keep things in, and that's inherent with being a man. I still want to have an identity as a man. If I want to remove those things, right? So how do I reconstruct something else, right? And that seems to be a big part of the conversation going on now. At least my sense of a big part of the conversation that's going on now, if we do disentangle some of these pieces, right, around toughness, stoicism, putting your emotions in, etc., power over women. What do we do to construct a masculinity that is distinct from femininity, but still a masculinity?
Yeah.
And I think we're struggling with that, and that seems to get to this piece that you're kind of getting at, Paul, a little bit.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, the optimistic side of it, saying that, look, it is socially influenced, is that it can be changed,
Yeah.
right? It's something that is flexible and that is, I imagine, changing over time. What has been your kind of perception of how masculinities are changing in, long-term history or even in shorter times since, COVID or something like that?
Our sense is that masculinities have changed. I mean, even that's an interesting thing in and of itself, right? Like when I started as a graduate student, it was men and masculinity. Now it's masculinities, right? That's an interesting reflection, just that we have this idea of multiple masculinities. But I think we have anecdotally a little sense of it, just like I look at my dad and my stepfather and kind of see like what they look like, and my grandfather, and my understanding and my options as a man are
Mm.
different than theirs. But interesting. I listened to a podcast not too long ago, just the last few weeks, Paul, and it's a great podcast. It's called Paternal, and
Mm.
the podcast is it's kind of framed around being a dad and fatherhood, but it's a great just a podcast about masculinities, really.
Mm.
And they were talking about TV dads,
Okay.
and they started in like the 50s, and we're looking at like the dad just
Yeah.
he really didn't do that much. He kind of just popped in a little bit and like would
Yeah.
just be like, good job, son, and then he would go off to work in his car and then in his suit and things like that. And then they looked at just how that the dad looked over time, like a little more flexibility into the 70s, and then into the like the 80s and 90s. Now we have like dads that are more engaged. We have multiple identities of dads. We have multiple racial identities. And then eventually we have different identities. Like we have stay at home dads, we have gay dads, right? Things like that. In fact, as I was thinking on that, one of my favorite shows that was on in the 2000s and my wife and I would watch was like, it was all about stay at home dads. And it was a really funny show. It got canceled. I was really sad about it that it got canceled. But I think the idea is like you think of a show about like Modern Family and two gay dads raising an adopted daughter, or a show about stay-at-home dads is just like anathema in the 50s,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah,
so I think it shows us kind of the evolution just via television of what a dad can look like, and that's also via what masculinities can look like. And so I think we're still working to try and help the world look more flexible for guys, right? But I think that shows us that they do have a lot more flexibility than they did than, like when my grandfather was a young man.
absolutely. And I think that's a really poignant example, right? Because you said before, what how do we know what a healthy masculinity looks like that isn't necessarily construed as femininity?
Yeah.
And I think that's a great case example is fatherhood, right? Modern
Yeah.
fatherhood has been a great example of guys being more engaged, more connected with their children. And I think it's a really interesting example of how maybe some of what might be thought of as a traditional masculinity is now being wrapped up in healthier ways of being around connecting with
Yeah.
family, supporting family, not just financially, but emotionally, being involved, being available, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think fatherhood's a great representation of that. And I think it's a bit more, I think it shows a bit more of the, I don't know, expectation of dads, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but that it's not just, well, here's these dads that are kind of doing this nice thing. But yeah, the expectation is that no, we want dads to be, engaged people, in their kids'
Hmm.
lives, and not just kind of they just don't touch them on the head and go off to work, right? But that
Yeah.
we expect that, and dads want to do that, right? That dads want to be those people who are engaged with their kids. And so yeah, I think that's a great point, Paul, to look at that through the lens of fatherhood.
Yeah. My other takeaway from that is the process of making that change. Like we're talking about tectonic plates shifting. This
Mm,
isn't just a quick fix, it's an
sure.
entire culture around fatherhood. That's not just the onus is not just on men to make change. It's on everyone in society to think about those relationships and interactions differently. And so this kind of brings me to my next point around
Okay.
social connection. And how do these values, how does our masculine identity, masculinities interact with how men socially connect with each other?
Yeah, as far as expectations or ideas of how men will connect, yeah, I, trying to think through that a little bit of like how men connect. In some ways, I think it's been pretty consistent,
Okay.
likely over time, like how guys connect and what that looks like. You probably for a long time, you've seen guys the way they connect, right, is let's go do things together.
Yeah.
I'm about to go on a backpacking trip with a good friend of mine, and that's one of the deep ways that we will connect is that that kind of side by side doing an activity together, but it's also a way that's easy for us to get into the what's happening in our lives and the deeper things in lives. And I imagine for now as well as for a long time, that's been one of those ways that guys have connected, is through that doing kind of thing, right? But I imagine there's some other things that have more recently helped guys a little bit in the way that they connect. For example, there's a friend of mine who's a engineer. You think of engineers, right? Like kind of the traditional guys, like this guy too, like he he builds things, built a yurt for his family, kind of technical like that, has a kind of stereotypically masculine job, but also is at a book club, right? And so this kind of thing where you go and do something and you connect with other people and you talk about the book, right? But my experience of doing like a book club is it's also an avenue to share your life as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that that's something that like I don't picture my either my fathers or my grandfather going to a book club. And that's something that I think is maybe opened up as kind of some space
Mm-hmm.
for guys to do some things like that. It's an opportunity for them to feel comfortable to do some things. So those ways for them to connect that maybe were unthinkable not too long ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find the juxtaposition between the different values really interesting and how some guys are able to navigate that quite comfortably to wrap up, going to a book club and still being, strong and independent in their own
Yeah.
way. Um, and we think of, I think of, contexts where men traditionally connect. You go to the pub, you have some beers. If you tell your buddy you've had a rough day, he's going to say, have another beer, let's forget about it. He's not going to say, tell me more. Let's
Yeah.
unpack that
Right.
for you.
Yeah.
So that would kind of suggest that, maybe that connection could offer more. But then there's the flip side of that around some of these values related to teamwork and camaraderie and being useful, helping each other out, that I think are really valuable that we can tap into from a community collective, let's support each other kind of approach.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's some things like that where, guys are able to access, you're talking about camaraderie, teamwork, I think of, guys that are doing things like CrossFit, there's opportunities for those types of things where you can be involved in a collective activity together and still access those, but it does provide those things to them.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The other piece is around giving help versus getting help that I think is
Yeah.
quite interesting. And this is where I think, there are still some challenges that we are navigating where a lot of guys won't necessarily ask for help if they need it, but they're absolutely willing to put their hand up and help someone else, which I think, again, kind of comes back to those ways of being that we are so used to of, it's okay for me to help, but I'm never going to ask for directions myself, for
Yeah.
example, if I get lost.
Yeah, I think and I know that I think that you've been involved in some of that work of learning those things of guys saying like, yeah, I'll help out a buddy, absolutely, I'll do it anytime. But asking for help is a different story. I think that's really helpful information. I mean, I think that does put the onus on us or really encourage us to be asking, right? To be
Hmm.
asking our friends, our buddies, like, how are you doing, right? And what's going on, and to be more like helpful and proactive about that, right?
Hmm.
In that reframe of giving help. I think there's also some of that reframing, and I think it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword in this of trying to reframe this way, but it takes courage, it
Hmm.
can take toughness, right, to ask for help too. And so you're trying to align that with masculinity, right? and
Yeah.
and I don't know the research on that of trying to do that. I think of some things like the Real Men Real Depression campaign where there was some work on that, and they had some, showed some effectiveness of trying to align that with getting help for depression with some masculine values. And of course, the challenge, right, is then you're aligning it with a masculine value, and is that
Hmm.
something that we should be doing or we shouldn't be
Right.
doing? But I think for some guys that can connect with them of like it takes courage to ask for help. Like it
Yeah.
it takes toughness to ask for help. And so I think there's potentially the way to help them see it as that of like, oh yeah, like it that is tough. Like I got to be strong to ask for help. And I think there's a way to try and connect that with them too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's often a conversation that we have, something we struggle with around, are you perpetuating what you're trying to
Change.
challenge,
Yeah.
change? Or, are you aligning your message in a way that somebody will understand, and
Yeah.
framing it like there is strength in stepping up to tackle a problem can help to reframe it in a lot of people's minds for sure. The other piece I want to touch on is just how these connections have changed over time. Are we connecting in different ways? Are we connecting in different places in today's time than we were, even 20, 30 years ago?
Oh, Paul, that's a good question. Part of me thought, well, probably yes, that you have guys that are connecting in different ways and in different places, where you have these group experiences, that involve self-exploration, telling your story, and emotional exploration and vulnerability. And guys are open to this and guys come to this and they're a part of this. And I think there were things like this that are going on like in the 60s and 70s, but I think of again prior to that, like in let's say the 50s, like I don't think guys were doing things like that, right? Maybe they didn't have the luxury, they just come out of a world war and that wasn't an
Mhm.
opportunity. But in some ways there's the space to say like connecting and understanding my inner life. And typically in this experience that I'm talking about, that they see the value for themselves personally, but typically they're doing it because they understand this makes them, better person in their relationships, for their kids, for their communities. And so they kind of see the overall value, right? And so you see guys that understand the value of exploring their inner life and working on their inner life. And I think that's something that is a meaningful change
Mhm.
that I see, and I'm really glad to see that. And again, back to my example I gave a minute ago, I think of seeing guys having the space for something like a book club. Like I don't know if that's something that guys would have been safe to do that long ago. Like I feel like if when I was a kid, if my stepdad would have been like, I'm going to a book club to go talk about this book that I'm reading. Like I think you probably would have gotten made fun of or teased for that, and some guys still probably would, right,
Yeah.
based on where they are. And when I didn't really think much about it, I think there's probably in lots of spaces where somebody wouldn't think that much about it. And so the way for guys to connect, I think there's some more space for them to do that and do it in a way where they can not just do it, say, let's go hiking, let's go play basketball, let's go to the pub, but in other ways where they can be more kind of more vulnerable, open people.
Yeah. I did a bit of work around men's groups in my PhD, actually, and I talked
Okay.
to guys that were a part of these groups, and their experiences were really interesting. I mean, one way in which guys were shifting, there's a big coffee culture in Australia, right? So
Okay.
instead of going out for beers with the guys, they were going out for coffee, right? That was
Okay.
like their way of connecting. But there were some really interesting examples of where and how guys were connecting. And as you say, there is still pushback. One of the guys I remember said that his daughter referred to the group that he went to as dad's crying group, right? And it
Mm,
was a men's group where
yeah.
they would go and meet up once a
Yeah.
month and talk about
Yeah.
their lives. And so, there's obviously still some stigma and pushback. But I just love to see that these guys are interested in connecting. They see the value in it. One of the stats that stuck out to me, I was reading the Surgeon General's report on the epidemic on loneliness that came out. It's based
Yeah.
on US
Yeah.
data. And one of the pieces that struck me, now this isn't just men, we're talking everybody, but
Yeah.
since 2000s, the early 2000s, we spend on average 20 hours less per week with friends than we used to, just
Mm,
interacting with them, and 10 hours less interacting with anybody, strangers, people in the street, whatever. And I think it kind
yeah.
of speaks to our digital world that we exist in now, which has created many opportunities, but also there's
Yeah.
obviously some limitations in how we connect. But those stats demonstrate that it's not just COVID, right? It's not just this switch that
No.
happened in COVID. We have been
No.
trending this direction for a long time around spending less time together. And I think that's a really important thing to consider that yes, we can connect online, but it is different. it feels different. It's important to make an effort to get face to face with people.
Absolutely. And I think it's particularly important for guys in the sense of, I think the work is a bit more intentional for guys. I read an article, this was before COVID, this was a couple years before COVID. It was a New York Times opinion, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was about basically the person is coming into the stage of his life. He's about my age, so I'm about to be 45, and he's about to have his first colonoscopy. He and kind of considering some conversations with his friends who are about his age, who is going to pick you up for your colonoscopy? Your wife can't do it, and so do you have a close friend who you can call? And his experience is him talking to some friends, and basically everybody's kind of struggling to figure out like who is my guy friend that I can call, that I would feel like I could just pick up and say, hey, can you come get me? And it was this recognition of how limited their close social network was as men, and that looked different than their wives. Their wives' network was much richer and had been much better taken care of over
Yeah.
time. And I remember that hitting me because I was thinking like, oh man, like over time, like as my career had been established and as I'd become a father, my social network had never been huge as an introvert, but it had gotten smaller. And thinking about being a middle-aged man, like, oh wow, like that really hit me. And as a person, somebody who's interested in men's health,
Yeah.
and so I think it does kind of connect back to this piece of really having to work as men to build those connections because of their importance, but also it was clearly indicating the challenge that was already going on with guys.
Yeah. Ryan Reynolds did a kind of public awareness piece around
Okay.
going to a colonoscopy. I forget the other guy's name. They work closely together, but it was
Okay.
him and his buddy, and they went and got their colonoscopies together. So there's a great example of guys doing stuff like that.
Doing stuff that, yeah, I love it. I'll have to look at that. I'm sure it's hilarious.
Oh, it's really good. Yeah. So my next question has been on more of a personal note, and it's just like a self-reflection piece of, do you ever think about your own masculinity in day-to-day life and how much you uphold these values?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do. I think about it. This was you talked about this. You and I were in a meeting together, and you were talking about that me search, right? And so I do feel like as a researcher in this area, it's always on my mind. I'm always thinking about it. But really, I feel like I've thought about what it means to be a man, and really that's come to a head the most as a father,
Mhm.
but even more so as a father. I certainly thought more about like what does it look like for me to be a man as a husband, but then with two daughters really made me think a lot more about it, like seeing their experience in the world and thinking about what kind of man do I want to model for them, and what kind of experiences and conversations do I want to have for them about being a man. And so, yeah, that's been the part that's really made me think the most, is just having conversations about, my oldest daughter's 12. And she's pretty smart, she's pretty bright. So we've had lots of conversations, just about like, oh man, like being a girl and this boy did this and that didn't feel very good, or she feels like the girls have to experience this and that's just not fair and that's unjust, right? And me talking with her about like I agree with that, or a time or two like I didn't see that, I didn't recognize that injustice was experienced by you as a man in the world, right? That's kind of that privilege that I had. Thinking about ways that I can, try and make the world a better place for them as women as well. And so every day
Yeah.
is me search in my world, and that the women in my world make me a better man.
Hmm. Great example. So, what I like to leave people with, let's say someone was listening to this, they're now thinking about their own masculinity, their own identity in different ways. Do you have any kind of practical tips or guidance for somebody going forward of what they could do to kind of navigate these, maybe in their own interactions with other guys? Let's say they're trying to build stronger connections. How can they overcome some of these hurdles if they're feeling pressure to act in certain ways?
In my experience, it's been helpful to try and find community in other people that can tolerate those conversations, can be open to those conversations, support you in those thoughts, kind of be open to your process there. And so, whether it's a small group of guys, like where I've had a small group where we can just talk about what's going on and be open and vulnerable, or whether it's a mentor that I can process things with, but somebody that you can feel safe with, that's been really important to me. But that's maybe a little bit lower hanging fruit than going out and finding, more intensive experience like that I mentioned earlier, where you can really get a deep experience to help you through that process. Now, granted, I think what can be valuable about something like that is that you get support and structure and guidance along the way with people who are also going through that as well, and just trying to, learn more about what's going on and what's it like to be a guy, and what are some of the struggles that I'm having, with myself and my family and work, and yeah, facilitators like me, in that process, who are kind of scaffolding you through that process, right? And that can be really valuable to find an experience like that where it doesn't feel so scary, right? When you've got people who can help structure you through that. I think the valuable of things like that is that there's lots of places, on the internet, things like that, where you can go find guys that can lead you the wrong way, perhaps. And so I think some things like that could just give you some safe support to just help you process and be who you are. And you might have some other good resources, some explicit resources, but I think that can be valuable. And I think it's great if those people are other guys, right? Other men that you can be
Yeah.
open and vulnerable and safe with as well.
Yeah. I love that idea of a role model. It could be a role model in person, right? It could be guy you work with, it could be your father, it could
Mm,
be your
yeah,
coach, but coming full circle to what you were saying around, how that's represented on TV, maybe they're caricatures and they're kind of manipulated for our entertainment, but there are still some examples out there of healthy masculinities, of guys that are doing things in different ways that are still pillars of their social group, that are highly respected. And so I think
sure.
thinking of a model that you could say, that's kind of, I like that. I'm going to draw on that and see if I can, do some things that way and do the litmus test and see how it works for me, and keep some things, let some things go. And we're constantly evolving and changing. So I think that can be really valuable.
No, I love that, Paul. I like that. I like the term. It's so simple but powerful of a role model. And yeah, that's really flexible of what that can look like. But when I think of my own experience as a man trying to figure out what it means to be a man and a husband and a father, and just a good man in the world, I think of just mentors have been the most powerful experiences
Absolutely.
for me. And really that piece is role modeling, right? They've told me stories about what's going on in their life, and told me stories about, how their journey is looked and what it's looked like to be a father and a husband and a worker, right? And then I've taken those right lessons, and then I've integrated them into my life, and those have been some of the most powerful lessons that I've learned through role modeling.
Absolutely. And it's excellent advice. Well, thank you so much for your time, Matt. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking to us, and hope to connect again with you soon.
Yeah, it's been great, Paul. It's been a fun conversation. I appreciate it.
Be sure to check out the In Good Company website to learn more about men's social connection and peer support. Have a burning question or an idea for a future episode? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at mens.health@ubc.ca. Thanks for listening.